Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to give the keynote lecture at the CATE 2022 conference. I'm going to be talking about dealing with overheating. My name is Rajat Gupta. I'm a professor in Oxford Brookes University. I've been doing a lot of research on overheating in buildings over the last kind of 17 years now. What I'd like to do in the lecture is to give you an outline first of what I'm going to talk about. Start from really what is overheating, uh, talk a bit about our research on overheating in homes, our research on overheating in care settings, how do you track this overheating risk, and how do you deal with overheating through good design, and then end with some final thoughts, including some knowledge gaps that need to be addressed. Just a very quick overview about who we are. So I run the Low Carbon Building Research Group and the Oxford Institute for Sustainable Development at Oxford Brookes University. We have quite a few areas of research, but one of the key areas is looking at climate resilience and climate change adaptation, both of buildings and neighborhoods. And as part of that, we tend to look at overheating as well. Now, first thing to understand is what really is overheating, because that's one of the key things, and it's becoming a serious concern. So this issue of summertime overheating in buildings in temperate climates is becoming really widespread and increasing. And we know that in England alone, 20% of homes are at risk of overheating today. We also know that the research community and industry have revealed over the last quite a few years the extent, the severity, and causes of summertime overheating in different types of buildings, be it homes, be it care settings, be it in schools or offices. Uh, we also know that recently government has noticed it, obviously, and has produced mandatory regulations to tackle overheating in new dwellings. And this has been introduced through the approved document Part O of building regulations. But the climate change risk assessment report, last year clearly stated that for existing dwellings, there's little incentive to retrofit adaptation measures to reduce the overheating risk across the UK, and that really needs to be addressed. This also becomes more evident as some days back it was released that threshold temperatures for heat waves have been raised recently across the UK, and it's, as you can see in the south of England, Surrey, Berkshire, Buckinghamshire, 28 degrees is now the new limit for declaration of heat wave, which goes down to 27 degrees in Lincolnshire and 26 degrees in Yorkshire. So, and that's essentially happened because of the weather year data that was being considered before, which was pretty much outdated, and now it's been updated to more recent ones. But what this shows is that the recognition of when a heat wave is happening, the threshold temperature at which it's judged is being looked at quite carefully, because that has a direct effect on the occurrence of overheating in buildings. Despite all this, there's really currently no universally agreed definition of overheating, and more specifically, at what temperature is a space or someone in that space overheated. Uh, this will become worse, as we know, as we have warming climate, as temperatures increase. Overheating, is already becoming a design problem for buildings. It's going to get worse. What we don't want to do is build new homes and buildings today and only wait for them to be retrofitted, for tackling overheating later on. We want to build that resilience now. Uh, there are lots of criteria for looking at overheating. I'm going to go into it, shortly, but they could be static, they're dynamic. They really help in determining the potential risk of overheating in a space. There are several criteria for overheating. There's SIPSI Guide A, which benchmarks summer peak temperatures and overheating using static thresholds, 26 degrees bedrooms and 28 degrees in living rooms, and whereas school offices. Essentially, it looks at occupied hours over a year and says if more than 1% of annual occupied hours are greater than these thresholds, then the spaces are overheated. There's also more robust SIPSI TM52, which is looking at the criteria for defining overheating, mostly in free running buildings. And that really relates overheating to the running mean outdoor temperature, which helps it to calculate the maximum threshold temperature, and then the measured or the model temperatures are compared against those. And if the internal temperatures fail two of these three criteria, whether it's hours of exceedance, daily weighted exceedance, or upper limit temperature, then the space is said to be overheated. But this is essentially for free running buildings where adaptive opportunities are available. There's also the criteria from standard assessment procedure, which assumes 23.5 degree C at the threshold, and that kind of calculates it for June, July, and August. And if the mean internal temperature is greater than this threshold of 23.5, a high risk of overheating is predicted. Passive house planning package also has a threshold, which is 25 degrees. And for the moment, it's saying that if 10% occupied hours are over 25 degrees, then um, uh, the space is said to be overheated. There is also the housing health and safety rating system, which looks at 25 degrees C as the outside temperature and says that adverse health effects increase when external temperatures are more than 25 degrees. So you can see that there are range of criteria for assessing overheating, and that's also one of the problems. But this is getting increasing recognition clearly, and different criteria may need to be used for different types of buildings. There is some consensus coming up for UK dwellings, at least. There was a guidance released by SIPC, TM59, which has really given the design methodology for the assessment of overheating risk in homes. And this has essentially focused on thermal comfort in living rooms and bedrooms so that sleep is not disturbed. And what TM59 is saying is that if bedrooms in UK have over 1% of annual occupied hours, over 26 degrees C, they are deemed to be overheated. For living rooms, a threshold temperature is defined, which depends on the running mean outdoor temperature. And if over 3% of the occupied hours between May and September exceed this threshold, the space is deemed to be overheated. So there's beginning to be, a combination of static criteria and dynamic criteria in determining overheating in UK dwellings. And against this, really, we've been doing a lot of research on identifying the risk of overheating, both in existing and new build homes. We'll quickly run through some of our projects and then focus on also series of projects on care homes. So, but first on homes, and we started this, really in 2015 when I was doing this EPFRC funded project called SNACC, looking at really adapting neighborhoods for a changing climate. And we were using a well-established model called Decorum, which is a carbon mapping tool to really look at the adaptation capability by using future weather data to predict the risk of overheating, in neighborhoods. And what we found was, as you can see here, that homes in the southeast we found were likely to overheat sooner than other regions. We found orientation has an effect. Homes on exposed streets, those which have darker pavement, external wall and roof surfaces that are dark, they usually increase solar energy absorption. Built form, having either or both a small floor area and limited external wall area can lead to the risk of overheating. The location of glazing, if you have roof lights, then you may have more chances of getting overheated. And of course, lightweight versus heavyweight home. So really, it's glazing, shading, ventilation that really kind of mattered. We also use that urban energy model to assess the potential for climate change mitigation and adaptation measures. And you can see if those are deployed, then many of the red homes can become green. So, and we use Green Deal that time because that time, Green Deal was seen as one of the retrofitting, packages. And essentially what we found was that you need a, external insulation package along with some shading and natural ventilation to provide resilience against overheating. We then went on this was 2014. In 2015, we looked at some new build social housing, which had some vulnerable households. And we were looking at both static and dynamic criteria. The static criteria, which I find is less stringent, is 4 out of 6 dwellings we found were demonstrating overheating, and bedrooms were really overheating in all the houses. Dynamic overheating assessment, really showed the space were not getting overheated that much using this method. We then continued this work and looked at more low energy homes across the UK. And interestingly, things started to become much worse in terms of overheating. Static criteria again, we looked at 5 dwellings and we found bedrooms were again overheated. And then dynamic criteria said one dwelling bedroom, was overheated. We then looked at overheating risk in new build, retrofitted, and existing UK dwellings, and this is all published as a paper. And we looked at 63 dwellings in terms of their monitored temperature. We were looking at bedrooms and living rooms. And what we found some very interesting things. First of which was that in flats, we found that overheating duration was at least twice to 4 times the other dwellings. So flats will, because of, limited exposed floor area. Then mid-terrace houses have the highest degree of overheating in bedrooms. End terraces had the lowest levels because they could probably lose heat more than mid-terrace houses. New builds we found had the highest level of overheating in living rooms, and insulated dwellings experienced overheating approximately twice as frequently as those without. There's some interesting things coming out of this kind of meta study kind of paper. We continued our work and looked at some modern low energy flats in Surrey. They're quite expensive kind of flats here. And we found that 3 out of the 4 flats that we had studied overheated. And we found that the fourth floor flats, top floor flats were overheated, but not the ground floor. And overheating, again, we found was more prevalent in bedrooms than living rooms. And dynamic overheating assessment showed slightly less occurrence of overheating, but again, flats really came about, and as spaces really overheated with lack of cross ventilation. We then also looked at another development in York. These were not flats; these were houses, mid-terrace detached houses. And again, 4 out of the 6 dwellings overheated. Bedrooms again were overheating more than living rooms. So this is a matter of concern that spaces where people sleep during the night are actually overheated more. And the dynamic overheating, again showed the same thing, that 3 out of the 6 dwellings were overheated. We then carried on with our work and we went on to look at the risk of overheating in care settings, which, as we know, are quite vulnerable settings and need to be kind of looked at carefully. And the reason why we looked at care settings was because there's a direct link between overheating, older people, and care sector. And as you know, that heat-related mortality during heat waves has found to be highest amongst occupants of residential and nursing homes. And this has happened despite the presence of care staff that could act to protect vulnerable residents. So care homes are really, vulnerable settings that need to be protected from summertime overheating. This became evident, not this climate change risk assessment report, the previous one, 2017, and also actually the recent one, along with the National Adaptation Program, has identified summertime overheating in care settings as a key risk and research priority for the health and social care system. Vulnerability of care settings, of course, has been further exposed during COVID-19. So, overheat, if that COVID-19 has proved to be a risk, I think overheating is also going to be a big risk as we move forward, especially for the care sector. We also know that care homes are vulnerable to energy price increases, and many of these care homes are facing huge electricity bills. So maladaptation is not possible. So we can't say there's overheating, let's do air conditioning. That's not a solution. We have to kind of go for increased passive ventilation or cross flow ventilation where we can. And the other problem is that care homes have been designed, built, and operated with the aim of keeping residents comfortably warm all year round, which is probably a culture change that's required, because in the warm weather might need to change ingrained practices in care homes. And also there's very limited research on assessing the prevalence of summertime overheating in care settings, both in the UK and internationally. There is relatively lack of empirical evidence there, which needs to be gathered. So our work has really, since about 2015, has really focused on climate resilience of care settings. We've been undertaking portfolio of work in this area. I started off by leading this project for Joseph Rowntree Foundation, looking at 4 case studies across 2015-16. We then went on to do a NERC funded, one of the Research Council funded project, looking with partners in the University College London and LSHTM. And we were looking at a pilot study of London-based care homes here. And then other project is looking at nationwide study of care homes. And starting with the first project, which is the JRF study that we looked at. Here we looked at four care settings. Two are care homes, across the country, as you can see, and two are extra care homes. The difference between the two is that, think care homes are really single bedrooms with access to on-site care services, whereas extra care homes are more independent. They are rented or purchased flats or bungalows. They're designed for people with mobility difficulties, and there's some help and support available if there's an emergency. So we looked at these kind of four care settings. It was one of the first studies looking at overheating in care settings. And what we found is very interesting. Found that most of the spaces are overheated, whether you look at adaptive method or dynamic method and static method. So we looked at offices, bedrooms, and communal areas, so lounges and dining areas. And as you can see here, for the four case studies, you can see there's occurrence of overheating. So what we found really, is published as a report, and this is kind of being downloadable, that as for the static overheating assessment, we were looking at about 33 spaces, and out of those, 25 were overheated. And the overheating was highest in the residence rooms. As per dynamic overheating assessment, again, slightly less number, but 7 out of 33 rooms overheated. And remember, in care settings, there is relatively less scope for adaptation because health and safety and other concerns, take over. So you can't open the window to the level that you would want to. There are restrictors. It only opens about 100 mm. And when we kind of went into detailed, monitoring, we found that indoor temperatures increased significantly during periods of hot outdoor temperatures, especially short-term heat waves. So not the heat wave where, I was talking about previously, where this could be, over 3 days and then a heat wave is declared. Talking about really short-term occurrence of hot weather, and indoor temperatures increased significantly. During the heat waves, none of the residential communal areas in the case studies remained below 26 degrees. Interestingly, that is the threshold temperature, which is suggested by the heat wave plan for England, which is saying that at least one area within the care setting should be below this temperature to provide a cool area in case there's to reduce the likelihood of heat-related illness. But none of the spaces that we monitored, really remained below 26. They were all higher than that. So some very interesting results came about with that first project, which led us to the second project, and this was with the National Environment Research Council, where we undertook a pilot study of care homes, with support from Care Quality Commission, which is the kind of regulator of care settings. And we did some feasibility work by developing new methods, knowledge, and insights to enable care provision become more resilient to rising heat stress. And we used environmental monitoring, thermal comfort surveys, interviews with care staff and residents. And we also did modeling to assess future overheating risks along with health outcomes of overheating. We looked at 5 care settings across London. Some of them were quite old, heavyweight buildings. Others were quite new buildings, recently built, and some of them in the 1980s. So we had a good mix. There were 5 care settings located in London, but with very distinct characteristics of building age and building form. And what we found against all the care homes, this is really interesting, and this is we did that in 2018-19, that all monitored locations really, were having fixed temperature overheating using the SIPC Guide A. So they were having, temperatures above 28 and 26 degrees for more than 1% of occupied hours. And many of these monitored locations even failed the dynamic overheating metric. So you can clearly see that the dark, the black line here is the static threshold, and you can see how temperatures are above that across different spaces of care settings. We asked for thermal comfort surveys as well, and some interesting things appeared. We were looking at staff and residents in care homes, and again, we were trying to see the perception of comfort, obviously, through this. And we found there was disparity between indoor temperatures that staff considered warm and hot, and those that residents found warm and hot. So really, residents were not perceiving higher temperatures as much as staff who were more active. So median temperature when staff described themselves as feeling hot was around 29 degrees C, which was, for residents, it was 32 degrees C. So you can see here that some external action is necessary because the residents are not able to identify when the threshold for overheating can get crossed. And you can also see that care settings are such hybrid buildings that they've got residents and staff with quite different expectations of indoor thermal environment. So the key findings was really in the pilot study of 5 care homes, building upon the first JRF study that we did, that overheating was found to be prevalent and prolonged across all the care settings. Interestingly, it was less severe in the older care home, which also offered scope for ventilation. The older heavyweight care home experienced lower mean temperatures in bedrooms across different spaces, lounges and offices, than the newer care homes. Again, across all the care settings, warmest locations were the bedrooms. And I think that's really interesting that even in the homes, we found bedrooms to be the warmer spaces, and even in the care settings, they're coming across the same. And average bedroom temperatures were higher at night. Again, it's not that bedrooms overheat more than living rooms, but the temperatures are higher when you're sleeping. And this was because bedrooms were occupied with doors and windows closed. They had single-sided ventilation. Carers would spend time in lounges than in bedrooms, and they were more likely to implement strategies for cooling than in the lounges. So you can see that it's a combination of the physical aspects of the care setting along with the practices that are deployed in care settings that is really accentuating this risk of overheating in care homes. Then the ongoing project that we're doing is a extension of the pilot study from NERC, and this is a nationwide study that we are doing. This is still happening. It goes in 2023. It's again Oxford Brookes, UCL, LSHTM doing it together. We are trying to quantify climate-related heat risk in care provision at a national scale. So moving on from a case study based to a national kind of a study. And we are doing longitudinal monitoring. And our aim is to do 50 care settings. We've got about 34 recruited at the moment. We are assessing the impact of heat exposure also on the health of residents in a subsample, and use all this empirical data to develop a building stock model of UK's care provision. These are some very preliminary results looking at some of those care homes that we recruited. And these results are from August, September 2021. So they're not, really peak summer. It's towards the end of the summer. And you can see what's really interesting is that the maximum temperatures are going above 29, hitting really 31 degrees in some of the bedrooms. And this is not even kind of summer. It's towards the end of the summer. We'll have better results from this summer. And predominantly, the bedroom C10, it's a pretty warm bedroom that we found. So I think it's worth noting that this is really happening because of limited ventilation that's happening, across these spaces. Then we looked at the overheating risk, and again, we looked at static criteria for care settings, and we found that for the periods monitored, all spaces were found to be overheated. Offices had 14% of occupied hours that were overheated. Lounges had 5%, and bedrooms were between 13 and 97%. So clearly, this is a current and serious risk that needs to be tackled. So how do you, first track overheating? And I think one of the ways I would suggest is by developing indicators. Government's very interested in this, and this also helps in really seeing what is happening. And really, the way it's tracked is at the moment, dynamic thermal models are used to predict the likelihood of overheating in new buildings, and measurements and inspections are used to identify overheating in existing buildings, which is what, to some extent we have been doing as well. The physical form of buildings matters, definitely, but I really want to emphasize that the way people occupy them is equally important, and obviously along with changes in the climate. So a socio-technical approach to developing overheating indicators is probably necessary. And there are some indicators out there, which are being used and considered through the climate change risk assessment as well. And they range from, areas of urban green space to heat-related deaths per year. But I think from a passive design aspect, number of hospitals that experience overheating or are implementing Heatwave plans, instances of overheating in care homes and surgeries, lost productivity from extreme heat, and temperature and air quality monitoring and how much of that is prevalent across different care homes, could also be tracked. And this I find really interesting, number of and spending on passive cooling measures in different building types, care homes, healthcare facilities. So that could also be used as one of the indicators. We tend to look at more, heat related deaths as an indicator, but what I'm arguing for here is there are other indicators as well, such as, those passive cooling measures. Um, so how can you tackle this, through passive measures and user-centric operation? So I would say, presence of cross ventilation is essential. We need to look at extent of window opening. This can be limited to 100 as I said, due to safety and security reasons, but this needs to be kind of looked at carefully. Presence of thermal mass in heavyweight buildings will, of course, make a difference. External shading will matter, and especially in the southwest and east facing facades. And again, external shading can be of different types. Shallow plans, I would say, rather than deep plans. Light colored surfaces, on the outside would kind of radiate heat off the building. Corridors need to be adequately ventilated, because we find that often it's a route for hot water pipes, and there's a lot of uh, chance that there's unwanted summer gains from those pipes. And then not just at the building level, green and blue infrastructures, planting and water features can also help to reduce urban heat. So those are some of the kind of passive measures that really need to be looked at. Of course, ventilation here is key. Then not just the building, I think we also have to empower occupants to manage overheating. And there are various ways of doing that. We need an intuitive, accessible, and usable ventilation and shading system with advice on how to use that. It's not, sometimes it's counterintuitive. We might need openings of different sizes to offer flexibility, some that people, of certain kind of age group can open easily. We need some, user manuals on staying cool in summer. We also need provision of shaded balconies or other communal spaces, where people, especially, vulnerable occupants, can escape from heat, what we call cool rooms. And we shouldn't undermine the power of gathering data. So temperature monitoring could help protect the elderly, ill, and disabled. They can help by alerting them and their carers to impending elevated temperatures. And that kind of, data flow can help with decision making quickly. And there are organizational measures as well, looking at heat wave plan implementation, what alert level response is done, and whether it was successful or failure. And then we've been working with UCL to develop this overheating audit list, checklist and tool for care homes. And again, that could be used as well to look at different adaptation strategies for overheating. That's the effectiveness, affordability, and feasibility. So my final thoughts, I want to kind of end with some, insights about knowledge and data gaps, which can help you with, in the conference discussions as well. Overheating indicators and guidance on retrofit and remodeling are limited. And I think we have to focus on existing stock. I think the new can and should be designed to, reduce overheating risk, but it's the existing stock that we really need to address. And we urgently need regulations and supporting guidance to ensure that retrofit measures improve heat resilience. And for that, I firmly believe that passive cooling provision, especially through natural ventilation, shading, is necessary. We have limited evidence on measured impact of these adaptive retrofit measures. So for those buildings where these measures have been deployed, we need to know what difference that made. We also need to know the number of buildings which are currently adapted to overheating. There is relatively less availability of good practice in dealing with overheating. It might be worth tracking what's the spending on passive cooling measures in different building types, in especially the existing buildings. Indoor temperature monitoring, I've argued for, must be encouraged. It's low cost, but we also need agreed protocol for not just monitoring, but also interpreting those measurements so that we consistently determine whether or not a space is overheated. And I think there's some work to be done there. Then finally, I would say designers must anticipate, future climatic conditions and changes such as increased daytime occupancy for new buildings that may last 60 to 150 years. So we must encourage designers to design buildings with that future climate risk and not something that can be pushed down the years. I think it needs to be looked at now. And then my final point would be that evidence on the implementation of heat wave plans in different types of building sectors needs to be looked at and refined where necessary, because not everything that is suggested in the heat wave plan may be implementable. I'm going to stop here. Thank you for listening, and I hope this gives you some bits, to talk about and discuss and address some of these knowledge and data gaps that we have in dealing with overheating. Thank you very much. I'm also grateful to my research team, Matt, Craig, and Alistair Howard, and also my research partners in University College London and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Thank you.